Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Building Power Grassroots Education Advocacy with me, your host, Zakia Sankara Jabbar. Today, I am delighted to be joined by my sister friend, Dr. Khalilah Harris. And Khalilah Harris is the Managing Director of Education Policy at the Center for American Progress. And so she and I will be chopping it up today about all the things education and racial justice. However, before we get to my colleague Khalilah, I want to start this show by paying tribute to my dear friend, sister, colleague, um, just all around great person, Allison R. Brown. And Allison was a great friend of mine. She was a believer in what grassroots education advocacy is all about. She was the very first person to invest in my leadership when I co-founded Racial Justice Now as a parent advocacy organization in Dayton, Ohio, and doing work that organized working class Black parents in that community. And so we lost Allison this past weekend, who she fought a valiant fight against liver cancer for almost 3 years, liver and pancreatic cancer. And so I just felt it was appropriate to lift her name up, for you all to see her, to know her impact in this work in education and education advocacy. I'll just, share a little bit about just who she was. She certainly was the executive director of the Communities for Just Schools Fund, which Communities for Just Schools Fund is an education organization intermediary that funds grassroots organizations all around this country, led by the people who are directly impacted by the school to prison pipeline specifically. So parent-led organizations, student-led organizations, also teacher activist organizations who are allies of parents and students pushing to end the school to prison pipeline. She was also the founder of the Allison Brown Consulting, a service organization that worked with schools, students, and families to bring about improved academic outcomes through equitable school climates where all students would thrive. She worked as a litigation associate at the firm Crowell and Morning LLP in Washington, D.C. After law school, she clerked for Justice Theodore R. Bowman of the Indiana Supreme Court and for Judge David F. Hamilton of the United States District Court for the Southern District of Indiana. She also was a summa cum laude graduate of Howard University, HU, and a graduate of the Harvard Law School, where she wrote articles and editor for the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review. Very accomplished sister who used her professional acumen and her professional degrees to absolutely lift up and support the most marginalized in our community. So thank you, Allison. We will continue your work, and obviously our hearts and prayers go out to your entire family, but especially your children, your school-age children. So thank you all for allowing me to do that, to lift up our sister in this work, who gave so much to all of us. So without further ado, I want to get to Khalilah here, who is another amazing education justice advocate. And as I mentioned at the top, she currently serves as as a managing director for the Center for American Progress. And so, Khalilah, I would love for you to just jump right in, tell us, a little bit more about how you got into education advocacy. I know you worked in the Obama administration as well, doing some education work there. Can you tell the audience a little bit more about you and a little bit more
Sure,
about your work?
absolutely.
Thank
So,
you.
first and foremost, thank you for having me. You know, I love to be in the same room with you, making sometimes good trouble, sometimes not so good trouble.
Right.
Like, it's all right to make good trouble. Sometimes we gotta, you know, knock the bricks off of someone. But
That's right. That's
you know,
right.
it's interesting because I always start my background back when I was knocking on doors in projects in Brooklyn, New York with the NAACP, Brooklyn Youth Council,
Yes.
registering people to vote when I was 14 and 15 years old. So that was my formal entry point into doing justice work on the ground, and my knowledge that no one was coming to save me or my community, and we had to get out there and make sure we exercise the franchise. And what's unique about Brooklyn is everybody is from somewhere, but you have all these folk from the South in America, from Central America, from the Caribbean,
Right.
from all over. And politics is always in discussion. You can go down the sidewalk at a bodega and see people's abuelo, their tío, their cousin, playing dominoes and talking politics. You can go across to the Jamaican restaurant and you see your uncle and your other people them playing dominoes, talking about politics, and like really in depth and understanding, you know, that we voted in New York, in Brooklyn in particular, for people who were for us and
Right.
not based on party lines. So we had an open primary system there where, if somebody sound good, but they're not doing things in the community and people don't know who they are, they could be in the same party, but they weren't getting voted in. So that was the grounding of my engagement in politics and policy. And then when I went to college, I immediately began tutoring in an elementary school that was in the middle of projects called Lexington Terrace. And at Lexington Terrace, I was tutoring kids who had no disability but were not able to read at the time that I was tutoring them, and I knew something was off there.
Right.
After college, went to law school, and I was saying to everybody in law school, I'm going to be a sports and entertainment lawyer, and then I'm going to, in 15, 20 years, open my own school because I know what we need to do for our community. And people were like, why are you here? So
Right.
by the end of law school, I ended up leading a program where we were teaching students in some of the big box high schools here. So I've been in this for a long time. And this was before we had the small schools reform and right before we entered into that. And having academies for ninth graders or different content areas. And I was managing law academies with an organization called Community Law in Action. And we were implementing the street law curriculum in partnership with Baltimore City Schools. And from there, within a few years, I was able to lead the team to design a new high school, one of the first two new high schools in Baltimore. And our high school was called the Freedom Academy. Focused on law-related education, social justice, family engagement, and using the community as a classroom. So we constantly were at our state legislature and at City Hall advocating for things that the students found important. And that really began my career in education policy and advocacy. I did a ton of work on advocating for new school facilities. So we recently saw a GAO report saying that 54% of the school buildings in this country are in disrepair. They need to be demolished or completely rehabbed. And of course, most of those buildings are in communities like Baltimore City. And so we were putting boots to the ground, advocating, knocking on doors to make sure we got funding to renovate schools in Baltimore. And this was all before I joined the Obama administration. After running a school for 10 years, I knew that there were things that I couldn't put my finger on, but I was experiencing every day with my school with 99% Black children. I hired mostly Black teachers. We were across the street from the projects now that are being torn down so that community can gentrify. They're going to rebuild it to luxury apartments. So, my engagement with education advocacy has always been that our community belongs to us and the schools belong to us. And so my work with the Obama administration allowed me to stretch that advocacy while I was working on my doctorate in education to really understand the theories and the expansive research around what I was seeing day to day on the ground. And in the Obama administration, with the White House initiative on educational excellence for African Americans, the biggest part of our role was to get out into community and make sure they understood what policies were being enacted for them and to hear from them what policies were working or not working. And so, that's probably the original place that I met you.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's exactly where we met.
Yep. Advocating for against the school to prison.
Against the prison, yeah, that's right.
And, it was our job to not serve as liaison. Liaison seems like a strange thing, but to make space and open doors for people who typically don't have access to Capitol Hill or the White House. And my career has continued on that vein since then. So right now at the Center for American Progress, I focus our work on community informed policy making.
Yes.
More of that buy-in stuff where I decide what's good for the community, then I come and get your buy-in.
Right. And that's usually how it works, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
I want to appreciate you for that, because, recently you invited me, my husband, you invited some activists from Baltimore a couple of months ago to come and help shape, I believe a policy platform that Center for American Progress is actually working on around funding, right? And around funding formulas and how we really need to be shifting the funding to be more equitable. Can you tell the audience a little bit more about that project?
Sure. So you will be seeing soon a major product from us that talks about quadrupling the funding for public education. And we're not talking about Title I. The Title I formula is very problematic. And almost every school in the country gets a little Title I funding. If you have students who are living below the poverty line or their families are experiencing financial distress. So our perspective is a one-time 10-year large influx of resources. The general public, based on surveys and data that we've seen, believes that the federal government contributes somewhere between 25 and 30% of funding to public education, and are not aware that it's more like 7%. And so our perspective is, let's take it up to 25 to 30%. Because the federal government has the capacity to see across all 50 states. If we're waiting for all 50 states to get into a room together and kiki and figure out how they're gonna make education equitable for all children at a baseline of quality, right? So does every school have a nurse? Does every school have a small ratio of psychologists and social workers to students? Does every school have a baseline of college access engagement and family support? So, and this is, people may recognize this through the concept of community schools, but this is beyond, right? It is the responsibility of the government that we pay taxes to provide for our children, to make sure there's a basic level of quality for all of them, right? Not that, too bad, so sad, your parents don't live in the right zip code, so you don't get enough taxes. And that's a piece of what we're proposing, that we use something called the Powell Exception. This is a part of the San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez Supreme Court case. And
tell us about that. I'm not even familiar with that.
So the Supreme Court found, let me take a step back. The plaintiffs were claiming that their constitutional rights were being violated by San Antonio ISD based on income. So that, poor people were not getting a fair share of resources for their schools based on the use of property taxes to fund schools. Justice Powell wrote the decision for the court and said, hey, listen, unfortunately, the Constitution does not recognize income as a protected class. So this is not, so they found against the plaintiffs. In that decision, he made an exception and said, in the event that a protected class's rights are being violated, using property tax to fund schools as a primary structure is unconstitutional. Well, here we are today with a $23 billion gap annually between expenditures for predominantly white schools and schools that are predominantly Black, Indigenous, and other non-Black people of color. We see $1,500 per child difference between expenditures on schools within a mile of each other based on zip code. And there are myriad of other pieces of research that overwhelmingly show race, which is a protected class. Race is a factor in property taxes being used to fund schools. And at this point, we should exercise that that exception. It's already decided. We don't need a new court case. We should exercise that exception and say property taxes are unconstitutional based on violation of the Equal Protection Clause, using race as a protected class. And
this is so interesting, because these kinds of cases, particularly around property taxes being the fundamental source that funds school, have actually been decided on state levels. And as you know, I came from Ohio, from living there for 20 years. And that's actually one of the areas when I was with Racial Justice Now, was actually one of the areas that we advocated around, because in Ohio, the Ohio Supreme Court itself had already ruled, I believe, on 4 separate occasions that it's unconstitutional from the Ohio Constitution's perspective to fund schools by property taxes. However, the legislature in Ohio has never created a remedy to that. And so I feel like even from the federal level, I completely support like this role that you are playing, particularly at CAP, and advocating for these equitable distribution of resources, and actually for it to come from the federal level to make it more equitable. But the other thing that I feel like we should think about advocating for, because I know I've said this in the past, is like income should be a protected class. The majority of people in this country are poor. The majority of people in this country are working class. And there are a myriad of ways that I see, even, when I was a working class person, right, that I could see the discrimination even just based on class status or even caste, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, the difficulty is the core issue of this country, that capitalism is a system built on oppression, is a system built on white supremacy, is a system built on racism. And so a core tenet of white supremacy is that people will vote against their own interests, because there's this pervasive understanding that I too one day can be rich. And, nobody should have the type of wealth that a Jeff Bezos has, or other people who are multi-billionaires, right? But somehow American dream gets translated into this individualistic, which is not natural, particularly to Black folk from our ancestral ties, this individualistic pursuit of wealth, that everybody believes that they too will one day be rich, whatever that means. And so we vote against our own interests. And we have people who get into office, sometimes extremely progressive folk, like, Lumumba in the South, and Baraka in Jersey. We have people who are really progressive, but then you start finding even Black middle class folk and other people of color saying, well, I've kind of made it, so I think that I may enter the upper middle class, or I may become rich because I can see it down the pipeline. My own kids are doctors and lawyers. And we vote against our own interests, because as long as
we do not talk about that, Khalilah. Oh my God. Like, I feel like that's almost a taboo. When you talk about like intra-community, like within the Black community, it's almost taboo to talk about class and the class distinctions, and how, like you said, like Black middle class people will vote in their own class interest against the interests of poor and working class Black people. And I just want to appreciate you for naming that. Seriously.
Listen, I mean, we're on social media together. I stay talking about the Black middle class being the bane of my existence when it comes to Black liberation and self-determination. And that's because they too have been sold the wolf ticket of, you can integrate into us. We will provide inclusion for you into us, and you're special. So come over, come live in our suburbs and go to our schools. You're special. You're not like the other ones. And people have a hard time wrapping their minds around that, because they do have parents who say, put your head down, work hard, and you will achieve the American dream. Well, there is no real American dream for anyone. There's the uber rich and the rest of us. And so as long as we vote in a manner, in the state of Maryland, this is how we've had a second term Republican governor who constantly legislates against us. But when election season came up again for him to be reelected, a lot of people saying, I like him. And he's talking about making sure we don't have more taxes. And I'm like,
yep.
Say what now?
I was actually shocked at the amount of Black people in Maryland that supports him.
Yeah, I mean,
that's new to me coming from Ohio.
It's new to me, and I've been here for 25 years. So, but now I have shifted classes a bit, and I'm in a circle of
me
people,
too,
right? Who are very. He's going to protect my small business, and he's going to make sure I don't pay more taxes, or that those people don't move into my neighborhood. And it's like, which people are you talking about? Your cousin and them?
Wow. Right. Your cousin and them, exactly.
So, we participate in this white supremacist structure of allowing our schools and communities we came from, and many of us still live in, to fall into disrepair when we have the means to take our children out, and we don't, in turn, it's got to be a twofold. Black folks should not bear the burden of having their children in schools that are not functioning. On the same
period. Thank you. No, say that again. Black people, yeah, go.
Should not bear the burden of having their children attend schools that are not functioning. It is not our responsibility to fix that. It's white folks' responsibility to fix that when they join us in breaking down these other systems that resulted in those communities looking like that. So redlining, predatory lending, both sides of the same coin, not building transportation access for people to get to jobs that are family sustaining, and instead have them in low wage jobs, which now we see we have the issue of Black and brown communities having their mothers and fathers going to work in low wage jobs because those jobs have been deemed essential, whether it's being a CNA and cleaning up the refuse in hospitals, whether it is cleaning up trash on the street, any of those
grocery
things.
Store workers, restaurant workers, the entire economy is open, right?
All of that.
And that's actually a good segue, I feel, sis, to you and I, and you and I have had this conversation on social media, but you and I also had this conversation on the SIP a couple weeks back with our sisters over at Higher Heights and Judith over at Advancement Project. But you and I, that show was about, this whole idea of the binary between reopening schools or virtual online only. And as you know, I have been, on the bullhorn, like, hold on, wait, y'all leaving out a whole mass group of people who don't neither one of these things work for. Number one, we don't have internet for all. There's literally 15 million children in this country who don't even have access to internet. So why are everybody talking about, oh yeah, you can just do it online? That's actually not reality for a hell of a lot of people.
Don't have the internet, and their teachers don't have
the internet, right?
They can't go to a library to get Wi-Fi, which is not a strategy at all.
Talk about that, because I know you and folks over at CAP are working on this, but you personally, I know, have a deep interest in this because you're also an advocate here in the state of Maryland. You're also an advocate in Baltimore. Talk a little bit about some of the strategies that you have been working on for your own community in your backyard in Baltimore.
So, it's actually Harford County in Maryland was a real springboard for this for me. And what they came up with was a strategy to help people go to work and a strategy to make sure children have access to school. They are not the same thing. We need to make sure all children have access to quality education as we work through the pandemic, as we get things on track. We're seeing in colleges, whole colleges shutting down because they let the kids come back.
We are seeing that. Notre Dame is the latest.
Crazy, right? And then the school in Georgia where the hallway have kids shoulder to shoulder.
That was in Cobb County where my cousin lived.
3 kids in a hallway of 100 kids with a mask on. Okay. So, and only to find out the week later that 10 kids have tested positive in that school. So, beyond that, we should have been talking about if schools don't open.
Right.
How do we support families who cannot stay with their children during the day?
Right.
And that conversation had not been had. It was this constant drumbeat of send them back to school, don't send them back to school. Send them back to school, don't send them back. I'm like, I don't care about y'all.
False binary, yeah.
False binary. How do you help people who have the lowest salaries but must go to work?
That's right.
find a space so that their children can eat, are cared for, have access to Wi-Fi to do their work. Now, if the whole school is virtual, that's fine. What Harford County is doing is every school building will open up 1 to 2 rooms so children can come and be supervised. I think it's not 1 or 2 rooms, it's a certain number of children.
Right.
The children can be supervised doing their virtual work, right? So there's an adult, there's a monitor, they can come in if a kid says, like they would to their parent, I don't understand this instruction, can you help me? Well, I need a snack. Can I go grab a snack? Like, yes, babe, you can go to the cafeteria. The snacks are in the basket, or grab an apple. But people have not been talking about that universally.
Not universally, not in the mainstream. I think like you, me, and those of us who literally have connection to people, real people, those of us who aren't so high that it's not our reality, we have been having these conversations, right? Like I was able to publish an opinion piece in Ebony, like really laying out this issue. And I think to your point, we're still not really having, and the other thing I would have to say too is that for obvious reasons, because teachers do have a union in Maryland and in places where unions are actually have legally binding contracts, is that teachers do have a certain amount of advocacy through their unions that they have been able to advocate for certain things. Unfortunately, students and parents don't have that voice, right? So we've been hearing, at least from my perspective, in mainstream media, we have heard from teachers and educators, and you and I both know teachers and educators who absolutely love their children and want to be, back, and educating in the way that they, like to do it best. Because I'm gonna tell you, a lot of teachers don't like this virtual either, because they got kids too. It's double work. So I mean, anyway, so what I'm saying is that I feel like, like we do everything else, we erase the most marginalized people in our society. And I think that if we start with the fact that we know that children are our future, people love to say that, like as a cliche, and we start with the fact that we know we need children to be educated for this 21st century world, then I think that we have to begin to center the fact that, yes, we are in a pandemic. We want people to be safe. We don't want people, to eventually contract the virus that can kill them, right? But at the same time, we need to be figuring out how to educate our children. Or are we saying that we're okay with losing an entire generation of kids to a pandemic where they're actually not learning at all? And so for me, the last part is also equally unacceptable.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't, this government and some people in this country like to wag their fingers at people who have low incomes, right? You didn't do all you were supposed to do. You didn't pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Now I'm going to take your boots and I'm going to take the straps, but why aren't you pulling yourself up by the bootstraps? Well, you just took the boots out my closet. What am I supposed to do? And people working 2 and 3 jobs because folk are still not willing to give a $15 minimum wage when we are now well beyond $15 being a meaningful minimum wage anywhere. It is not family sustaining. It is a little more, not a little more, it's a lot more than some have been being paid, but it's nowhere near what people need to work one job, see after their kids, make sure that their parents are taken care of if they're providing care to elders, none of that. So then to say, it's not safe for your children to go back to school, which I agree. There are schools with no windows. There are schools with windows that are soldered shut. There are schools where the HVAC is regularly not working. There are schools with asbestos tiles.
That's a big issue in Baltimore, I know. In other cities as well, DC, Detroit.
Oakland, so of course, places where there are a lot of Black and Indigenous and non-Black people of color, their schools are falling down around the children. But inversely, if you know that, and you know that there are high populations of families with lower incomes, why weren't you also discussing how to support those children accessing school in the same way their peers do, but making sure that there's a structure for their families to continue to work? Because then the flip side is, my mom had to keep taking off of work. She got fired from her hourly job. Now we're back using benefits. Well, you could have prevented the family relying on benefits to begin with if you just thought about how to use the same staff. Like paraeducators aren't online with students, right? The people who are normally, helping out, going from classroom to classroom, they can now monitor, the crossing guard, the school bus driver. There are a number of people who work in schools who would not have access to children, the family engagement specialists, all these people who could supervise the children, make sure they're fed, and make sure they're not running amok in the building, and then make sure they get home. Like, it's not rocket science, but people still are not universally discussing this. And the media also, you're right, is not lifting. They have allowed the conflation between send the kids to school so parents can work, as opposed to the children must continue their learning.
Thank you.
Many of them have parents who must leave the house to go to
work. Right.
And then you have the daycare situation as well.
Yep.
Most daycare is, my mom is a licensed home daycare provider. 80% of them are these small businesses out of people's homes, or, whatever the case may be. Many of them are closing.
Wow.
They don't have any children. So the kids who are school age that might need a daycare provider, they can't even get daycare because the daycare providers for the babies are closing down because they haven't been able to gain income the past few months. So it's this cycle of, I'm going to punish you because you were born in the wrong zip code. I'm going to punish you over and over and over, and then tell you it's your fault that you decided to be birthed into a zip code that doesn't have a property tax base that means you're worthy,
Right. And all of this is structural. I think what I want, the listeners to hear, and I also want to encourage people to drop questions in the comment section if you're with us on Facebook. We want to make sure we get to your questions here in about a couple of minutes here, but please comment questions. If you have any questions, let us know. I'll also try to take a look on my watch party as well to see if there's any questions for Dr. Harris here. But I think what we're pointing out and what we're talking about, Khalilah, is something that was pre-Trump, right? A lot of stuff gets dumped on Trump, and I'm like, people need to be honest, right? Like, white supremacy, capitalism, and anti-blackness has been here for centuries. Trump did not create that. Can you stop, please? The way we fund schools, all of these things are structural issues that we, unfortunately, and I think you talked about this a little bit earlier, neither party has had the political will to really deal with these structural issues. And I think you see my cynicism on social media a lot around this issue. And of course, it's based out of my experience, working in Dayton and Montgomery County, Ohio, incidentally, Dayton and Montgomery County, Ohio, where the political structure at the city and county level has been led by Democrats for the last 35 years.
Baltimore,
yeah. And so when you think about schools, and when you think about, also city infrastructure and food deserts and all of this, then you begin to see, okay, I got to go back and start looking at the city commission board meetings, right? The city commission meetings. How are you all making decisions on where resources go in the city? How are you all at the school board level, right? Because what you'll find, and you talked about this earlier as well, and I was thinking about here where I live now in Montgomery County, Maryland, like, even with school funding, there's even disparities within the same school district. So like where I live now, we even saw this in Dayton, like funding for schools in East Dayton was oftentimes higher than it was in West Dayton. And Dayton is very segregated in East and West. East is predominantly white, Appalachian white community, and West Dayton is predominantly African American, folks like my family that came up during the Great Migration from Alabama. And we would see, when we were paying attention and organizing and doing our advocacy work, like, oh, okay, well, why is this school getting more resources than this school? And the only thing that we could see was that it was divided by the river. Similarly, here in Montgomery County, Maryland, schools in Potomac, right, are funded at a higher level than schools in East County, which is where I live, in Colesville, Silver Spring area. So, these things are structural. And I think that the advocacy that we're trying to do and advocacy that we're pointing out is that, number one, you have to center the people who are most impacted in these communities. So parents of color, students and children of color, and make sure that they have the resources to be able to do the advocacy that they need at the local and even sometimes at the state level. One of the things I wanted you to talk about a little bit too here in Maryland is the Kirwan Commission, right? Unfortunately, the governor vetoed that. Can you tell our audience how, at least in Maryland, we were trying to remedy some of the funding issues with this Kirwan Commission to the audience?
Yeah. First, I want to say something about this within district disparity that you
Yes.
talked. Sometimes it looks like all the public schools are funded at the same level, but there are schools in the community who have a parent base that supplements what's happening in the school. So for example, in Baltimore City, you have 2 or 3 schools where parents are raising upwards of $100,000 to $200,000 a year to supplement the school's budget. Now, most of the schools, 95% of them are not doing that, but the 5% that are, their schools look very different. Recess has an extra monitor, or field trips are more expansive, and those kinds of things. So there's always going to be this situation, which is why it requires federal government, state government, local government to provide a baseline of quality. Because if it's only based on property tax, or if you only base it on everyone gets the same, which is equality, not equity, then you're going to constantly run this cycle, because people will always do more for their own children. So there's that. For Kirwan Commission, after the 2008 recession, about half of all states actually cut education funding. By the time we got into the last 2 years, half of the states still had not gotten their education funding back up to pre-2008 recession levels. Maryland was one of those states where, the governor kept saying he's providing record funding for education, which, yes, record funding means what you're funding in 2017 and 18 is more than what you funded in 1918 and 1920. Of course, it's going to be record high because there's inflation. So it made no sense when he kept saying it, but people bought it hook, line, and sinker. So they did some assessments. A commission was formed. Britt Kirwan was the chair of the commission, which is why it's called the Kirwan Commission. And it found racial disparity between school districts. If you think about Montgomery County and Howard County, where 2 of the most affluent counties in the country, not in Maryland, in the country, attempted to just look at redistricting the students in their communities so there was equitable access to quality schools, all the schools having a certain level of quality.
And so people lost their damn minds in Montgomery County.
Their minds, because what they were saying was, these schools are my schools. Why should we let those kids into my schools? And it's like, oh, you're one school district. What do you mean? And people believe, you also have some model minorities who believe this, if I work hard to move into this neighborhood, which is the problem of using property tax, if I work hard to move into this neighborhood, how dare you give my resources to those children?
Yeah.
Right? People who proclaim themselves to be liberal,
like Montgomery County. Oh my God.
Out of one side of their mouth.
We're going to have another show about that.
Listen, out of the other side of their mouths, though, saying, what do you, listen, no rule, nothing, no changes were made in Montgomery County. It was simply, let's study what it might look like.
That's right.
To rearrange some school zones within the district. People flipped their lids.
Flipped out.
School board meetings full to the
yes, they were.
So Kirwan Commission really was seeking to remedy the lack of funding. Maryland is one of the few states that in their constitution, education is a civil right for its population, public education. In fact, in Maryland, Article 8 of Maryland's constitution, it is the only mandate of the Maryland state government. There is no other mandate laid out in the Maryland Constitution other than providing access.
Education. Wow.
So the fact
I did not know that as a Maryland resident. That's why you hear it.
Yeah. So, I always bring up Article 8 when I'm in Annapolis or when I'm in City Hall, because this is our constitutional right. regardless of what the US Constitution says, the Maryland Constitution says, this is the only thing you must fund and ensure is providing adequate education to our children. And what Kirwan Commission set out to do is a number of things. Make sure there was access to additional funding with our HBCUs to build a more racially diverse teaching workforce, making sure that class sizes could be smaller. Professional development would include cultural competence, that we would see teaching conditions be modernized so that teachers were not in distress and coming out of pocket for the resources that children should have to learn. So a number of things in the Kirwan Commission, and the governor vetoed it. He had $20,000 a table fundraisers to put money together to lobby against the Kirwan Commission's recommendations. The legislation passed, he vetoed it, and because our session ended a month early, frankly, I will say that the Democratic members of our state legislature also did not exercise their will, because they should have convened a special session to override the veto on Kirwan.
Because we can do that. And Maryland has, if I'm not mistaken, you spend more time in Annapolis than I do. Yep. If I'm not mistaken, we have the Democratic votes to override a veto.
Yes, we do. Yes,
Very interesting.
And it's not only Kirwan Commission. It's a number of things.
Police accountability hasn't been over. Yep.
Making sure that there are pre-release centers for women, which there are none in the state of Maryland.
That's right.
Making sure that the 4 HBCUs in the state of Maryland receive their compensatory.
That's right. They won the lawsuit, but it was appealed by the state of Maryland.
And the legislature, because Governor Hogan was trying to offer them $50 million, all 4 of them to split $50 million, the legislature put in funding and passed that legislation to provide, I think it is $250 million for each of the institutions.
That's right.
So $1 billion split across the 4. And he vetoed it. But then they didn't call for a special session, which they still can do before the regular session begins in January. They didn't call for a special session. And the challenge with that is it delays justice.
That's right.
So when we think about holding our elected officials accountable, sometimes.
And when you think about who it continues to delay justice for.
Correct. Sometimes we get in our love muffin situation where our party is elected, or people who seem like they have the same values are elected, and then they get into office and they kind of do what they want, and we don't show up. So this is my speech about November 4th. If you don't like who the nominees are, if you don't like what's going on in your community, if you didn't think Obama did enough for you on November 4th, I better see that same energy that you have right now.
That's right.
Because no party is for us. Political parties are for themselves, to perpetuate themselves. And it is incumbent upon us to apply pressure. Nobody wants to be on Twitter with a bad story. Nobody wants people banging pots outside their house. Nobody wants people forming lines down the middle of the road, blocking.
Coming to their house.
Hello? And so when people ask, well, how do we hold them accountable? Put them on blast every day they don't
go to their house. That's what activists been doing.
Right? And so, we have a lot of people who were not exposed to politics. We had people last night at the Democratic National Convention. We had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Who I love. Oh my gosh.
I'm from New York.
Yes.
So she did the seconded the nomination for Bernie Sanders. Something that has to happen when people have enough votes. And people lost their minds last night saying, how dare she be on the Democratic National Convention?
It was procedural, but she had to do it, right?
It was more than procedural.
But people were mad that she didn't even mention Biden. First of all, can we talk about the fact that they only gave her 60 seconds? Can we talk about that?
Let's say they gave her
gave John Kasich more. Girl, we're gonna have to have a whole show about this.
Let's say they gave her 60 minutes. My issue is that is not the forum to talk about the eventual nominee. At the point that AOC was seconding the nomination for Bernie Sanders, no one won the nomination as yet. At that point, Vice President Biden's nomination was put forward and seconded. Senator Sanders' nomination was put forward and seconded. People underestimate that that is a very honorable position. It goes into the historical record. It is not some fly by night, just put somebody up there to nominate.
Yeah.
So it is an important historical thing that she was invited to do as a very junior congressperson. So I don't begrudge people for being confused. It just goes to show how many people have been tapped out of political process.
But honestly, Khalilah, I want to push you a little bit on this. It's designed. I know that Amos Wilson talked about this a lot. The apathy in communities who are most impacted is certainly is designed that way. Like I think both parties actually benefit from collective ignorance on how these party nominations happen. I think if it wasn't the advent of social media, we wouldn't even be, or the coronavirus, we wouldn't even be so intimately knowing all of these things. Like I've never been to a Democratic convention or a Republican convention. Personally, I have not had the desire to go, but I think, and I actually, if I'm honest, I haven't been watching, but my whole social media feed is like I've been watching because everybody's talking about it. It's like it gives a window and like, oh wow, this is how it works, right?
This is what they're doing. Yes.
This is a civic lesson.
I wouldn't even, for some people it's apathy, and actually I'd say the higher your income, the more it is apathy and ignorance because you have the means to engage.
Amen.
People who have lower incomes, experiencing homelessness, facing abuse, folk have to survive.
Exactly. Ain't nobody thinking about politics. They thinking about where their next meal coming from or how I'm like
their primary concern. So for folk in that situation, it really rubs me the wrong way when people wag their finger at them like you need to. And,
I agree.
And those same people haven't done the work to show them that they are with them. You need to do this, and I'm standing with you. I have means, but I got you. You need somebody to watch the baby when you go vote? I got you. You need a ride down to the poll? I got you. You can't really read that well. Let me do the voter registration with you. Those two things don't tend to go together. And then you have people with means, with college degrees and just access who had no idea how a presidential convention or a party convention functions.
Right.
Didn't know what it meant when Delaware passed, just to say, okay, we're going to pick up again and go last because the candidate is from our jurisdiction. No problem. It's okay. I love that people are debating it. But what's important, what I want folk to take away, or I hope folk will take away, is schools alone reforms are never going to work for our community.
That's right.
The entire ecosystem that the school sits in must be addressed.
That's right.
Otherwise, you're sending a message to children that something is wrong with them.
That's right.
People like to say things like, you need to get out of here. This is going to help you get out of here. Get out of where? This neighborhood made them have their grind. This neighborhood gave them resilience. They grandmama bringing kids in after school to give them some oatmeal if they're hungry, made them who they are. So to say to them,
to get out, right.
You get this, you and this small group of kids get this special school because this school has it all, is going to make sure that your scores show that you can pass tests. Not that you are capable of pushing against the system, advocating for yourself, practicing self-determination, but it shows your achievement is passing these tests, which we need to see what the kids' achievement levels are because that is also what shows us evidence of racism.
That's right.
That, if you're schools advocates cannot advocate alone for schools. If you're not advocating for transportation, housing, moving resources from your downtown.
Environmental racism and justice. You're talking about the virtual town hall that I actually have coming up, and we're covering all of those issues. Good. We're because Chris, our CEO, he's adamant about we have to take a social determinants of health approach to our education advocacy because education does not happen in a vacuum. Like you said, it's an entire ecosystem, and you got kids who are living in communities that are like ripe with environmental racism. I know Baltimore, like Flint, has similar levels of lead in the water and in the building
incinerator
and everything, right? So this is really critical. It looks like we actually have a question I want to make sure we get to before we wrap. We have about 10 more minutes here. There's a question from the chat on Facebook that says there are district disparities within predominantly Black counties by class. Question. For example, how is funding distributed between the rich and poor sections of Prince George's County, Maryland, one of the wealthiest Black counties in the U.S.? That's a great question.
Mm-hmm. So you have the same issue. If you look at Prince George's County, Maryland's school budget, and let me reiterate what the person asking the question asked. Yeah. Prince George's County has the most affluent Black people in this country.
Yeah.
Not in the state of Maryland, in this country, between Prince George's County and Montgomery County. So if you look at their budget, it's not going to show a disparity in how expenditures are made for schools. What people have is influence when they are more affluent. So there are parts of Prince George's County where families and community members have relationships with elected officials. So when it's time for their schools to get a renovation, their school moves to the front of the list, right? And, I really want to commend the current superintendent. She's a phenomenal Black woman. She's been looking at things through a data lens and strategic lens. But that wasn't necessarily happening before. It was very pay to play. I live in Upper Marlboro, or I live in this part of Prince George's County, and we want a new wing on our school. And we pay a lot of taxes. So who are you to say we shouldn't get that? So it's not a case where in Prince George's County, you're going to look at school budgets and see that this school gets more dollars per pupil than this school. What you're going to see is the distribution of renovations, which schools have access to AP and IB, which schools have educators who have been there for a longer term, and the racial diversity of those teachers. So all of those things come into play. It may seem like one school gets more money than the other, but I happen to know in the 24 school districts in the state of Maryland, they all do per pupil funding. It is those extras that show a difference in how children experience schools. So if these schools over here don't have access to gifted and talented, don't have access to brand new STEM labs, can't breathe because there's no HVAC, they may get the same per pupil, but equal is not equitable. Those are two different concepts. And unfortunately, we're so used to saying equality, equality, equality. We underestimate how people who want to hold resources from us swim in the gray area of equity. And we'll say, we want to make sure all of our students have equal access to ... No, because these students over here have had resources held from them by systems and, like you said, infrastructure and all of those other things. And so I say to people that yes, 2020 is off the hinges, but I really believe 2020 is here to heal us and not to harm us. There are a number of things where we got forced.
And stretch us and grow us. How many of us have had to pivot and grow and think creatively, like how to deal with this mess?
How to pay attention. How many people now who really had no idea what their kids were doing in school are paying attention to what their kids were doing in school? How many people are like, well, my child is the school district that my child is in is saying they're going to have 5 hours of synchronous learning. That doesn't seem right. No, the heck, it's not right. They should not be having any more than 2.5, maybe 3 hours for the older kids of synchronous learning at a computer screen. But now you see people, they were joking about homeschooling, and I really don't want to take away from the people who actually homeschool because they craft. But, people paying attention for the first time to how few resources the teachers in their schools had and how few resources, some of us middle class complain about bringing these bags of paper towel and wipes to schools.
Yeah.
Why can't everybody, I see that some parents aren't sending the paper towels and wipes. Hold on a second.
I know. I never did that. I would buy extra.
Extra. You understand the schools should provide that? That's what, the fact that there are families who cannot provide that is a problem. Schools should provide it. Right. So, it's important for us to focus on schools and our strategies around grassroots organizing for schools under the concept of the schools belong to us. They should be controlled by the community. Do not let school boards make decisions for you, and you kind of complain they won't let us and they didn't do this for us, just like you, Zakia and Hashem, you guys put those boots on the ground and said, not our children.
That's right.
And there's nothing stopping us from showing up into our elected officials' offices. And low key, most people don't do it. And elected officials,
that's real.
I listen to constituents who come to my office because I know that they will make a stink elsewhere.
Right.
So we need to get on it. Don't underestimate
That's right.
Sending those letters through ResistBot or any of those things make a difference, because elected officials are people and they don't want to look bad. So that's right. lot of leverage we have.
Yeah. So that's actually a very good answer to that question. I wanted to get to this brother's question. It actually came in on my watch party. He wanted to know, and I think this is a really good question: how do we make children development as a national strategic asset that needs to be developed, it needs to be invested and protected? Children development. There are people, unfortunately, I have to say, some educators who don't even understand basic children development. So that's why I thought that was a great question, because I feel like we don't even talk about that enough. Like, the school to prison pipeline to me is racist, is all of those things, but it's also like a basic lack of understanding of children development and what's appropriate for a child at a certain age.
Depending on their race. All of a sudden people understand childhood development when you're white, but when you have browner skin, they didn't understand that you acting out was, I can't sit in this chair any longer, or I'm bored, or any of those things, or I didn't eat last night. Nonetheless, when it comes to doing this overarchingly, the Department of Education is not the only one responsible for it. So that's at the local, state level, or the federal level. All states have a Department of Health. All states have a Department of Children's Services. So when you're thinking about legislation to make sure childhood developmental norms are followed, it needs to be again, an ecosystem of advocacy and legislation that is prioritizing the development of children. So when people say defund the police, and I know people don't like to hear that phrase because they don't understand what it means, I think people are actually being obstinate and they really do understand what it means. When you're moving monies away from a corrupt system, you shift the funding to systems that will prevent people from ending up incarcerated. Right? So it doesn't necessarily mean wipe out all protections for communities, don't have any way to address violent crime. It means that when you have police agencies like in Baltimore City, where the overtime annually was $40 million, $50 million, instead, you could take that $50 million and make sure the school buildings are renovated, or make sure there's free aftercare for all children who want to take advantage of it. Make sure there's not only breakfast and lunch, but there's warm dinner for all children who want to take advantage of it. Those things result in healthy and whole children who then don't need to go and slang on a corner, be in a trap house, and have a safe place while their parents try their best to provide for them. So those things all go together. It's not just the school system's responsibility to address childhood development. It requires our social workers, it requires our pediatricians and others to jointly advocate for systems that support, and to jointly advocate in their legislatures for school districts to prioritize norms of childhood development, and not just leave it up to the individual teacher to make a decision about what's happening with kids.
No, I think that's good. That's actually a very comprehensive answer to that. One final question. Somebody said a follow-up question. It says, does a report exist to note these resources? Hold on, I missed it in just a second. I hate when I get notifications on my... I think they were asking about if there was a report that these resources, so we can, I guess, know how to hold people accountable. Like, is there it sounds like they're asking about, when we were talking about the resource inequity, is there a place or report where people can use as leverage as a talking point when they go to hold people accountable about resource inequity? I'll take a first stab at that. I know that Journey for Justice Alliance had done a report around the equity between resources that predominantly white schools get and the $50 million gap that predominantly Black and other non-people of color schools get. So I'm familiar with that report, but I have to go back and do some research to see the link and the actual name of the report to put it in the comments. But do you know of any other reports like that, Khalilah?
Absolutely. So if you go to EdBuild, EdBuild, EdBuild has interactive imagery, multiple reports about school funding. An organization called Ed Council also focuses on school funding and the disparities in school funding. Those are two primary resources that if you go to them, they will point you in the direction of other tools you can use that lay out a 50-state look at disparities. The other thing I would say is if you take a look at the Movement for Black Lives, it also is pulling together a Black agenda. You can register for its convention on August 28th at blacknovember.org. And some people don't know where to get started in advocacy. I think that would be a great place to learn about the platform being developed and how delegations in your local states are functioning. I was a delegate for the state of Maryland. I'm also a non-resident senior fellow for the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. And most states have a similar institution that are focusing on school funding or do some work around school funding and equity. Also, state level ACLUs typically have these resources and data available for advocates to use. So there are a number of resources you can find to get this information and take it to them. You know, don't wait for somebody else to give you permission.
Thank you, Khalilah. We are at time. This has been great. This has been packed full of really good information for our audience. They had a very engaged comment section, both on my watch party and on the regular live from Citizen Ed's page. So just want to thank our daily, weekly viewers and appreciate you all for continuing to stay with us. Want to tee up that next week we will be welcoming Dr. Tunette Powell, who is the interim director of the UCLA Parent Empowerment Center. So we will again be talking particularly about parents, Black parents in particular, and how Black parents are supporting their children through this education and really national, worldwide pandemic crisis, and what we can be doing to help provide more resources and tools and strategies for parents in particular during this moment. Dr. Harris, Khalilah, my sister friend, thank you so much for joining me. This has been great. And obviously we will definitely have you back at another time. It may help to have you back after November 3rd to like decompress however which way it goes to talk about, okay, how are we going to refocus or re-strategize? Because however it happens, we're going to have to put pressure on either candidate or either person that comes in. So anyway, appreciative of you. Thank you. That today has been your Grassroots Education Building Power series with me, your host, Zakia. We'll see y'all next week. This was